First of all, I think the big mistake they made is they didn't cut more. And just very simple, if you look at the 2-year Treasury yield, Gunlock always points this out, that the Fed just follows the 2-year. And if you look at the delta between the 2-year and Fed funds where it was prior to the 50 basis point cut, you see that it was pretty much at an all-time extreme going back to the GFC. So what this is the market telling us how far off sides it thinks the Fed is. The Fed likes to use the term the neutral rate or the terminal rate or R star or something like that to determine, where the Goldilocks interest rate should be for Fed funds. And if you go back and look at history, what happens is when the Fed tries to catch up with the 2-year Treasury, what ends up happening is the 2-year Treasury doesn't flatten out or it doesn't start to go back up. It goes down even further. So as an example, let's say you've got the Fed funds at 5.25% and you've got 2-year Treasury, let's just say it's trading at 3.5. And then let's just say that the Fed cuts all the way down to 3.5. At that point, you never see the 2-year Treasury just flatten out and say, okay, the Fed is done. All the cuts already baked in. They've done their job. We're in this Goldilocks economy. Now the 2-year Treasury just goes forward at maybe 3.5, 3.55, 3.6, something like that. That's not what happens. They cut down to 3.5 or they're getting close to that mark, and then the 2-year Treasury just keeps going down further and further. The Fed, if you look at these interest rate hiking cycles, which obviously we have to get to the rate cuts, you see that they never go in kind of this gradual fashion. Like if you look at the dot plots or you look at their projections for where interest rates, the Fed funds, is going to be in, let's say, the end of the year or maybe end of next year. It's always this nice, slow decline. But then when you look at reality and you compare that with history, you see that they never drop rates in just a slow fashion. It's always like Wet and Wild. It's always like one of those water slides where you just start here, just boo, it's like a Wile E. Coyote thing. And the only time that I can see going back to, call it the 1980s or so, where they had a rate hiking cycle where they didn't cut dramatically was back in the mid 1990s. This was 1995, 1996. But during that time, you didn't have an inverted curve and you didn't have the unemployment rate spiking, which we can see just using the SOM rule as a broad proxy. So anytime that you have those factors, those huge, those very powerful economic indicators, especially when they're lined up, when you have unemployment spiking and you have not only an inversion, but an uninversion due to a bull steepener, which means the front end of the curve is coming down faster than the long end of the curve, you always, and that's preceded by a Fed rate hiking cycle, you always see a decline in Fed funds at a very, again, the Wet and Wild scenario. So that's why I said the Fed probably made a mistake, but it wasn't that they cut 50 instead of 25. It's that they didn't cut by 75. If your objective is to soften the blow, let's say, of a recession, then yeah, that's the right path. I'm not going to say that they're going to avoid a recession because they've never, ever, ever, ever been able to stop a recession through these rate cuts when we have all these other economic factors or indicators that are lined up. So they're always responding to a recession. They're never preventing a recession. But like I said, it doesn't mean that they can't soften the blow to a certain degree. They make it better than it otherwise would be, but that doesn't mean that it's still not a hard landing or it's still not devastating. I mean, look at the GFC as a perfect example. You could say that, yes, it would have been worse. Maybe it would have been, but it was still pretty darn bad, even though they cut rates. So you just have to ask the question, why have they never orchestrated a soft landing in the past? It's because they're always behind the curve. That's why they always follow the 2-year. And so if this time isn't different, which I don't know why it would be, then they need to follow the 2-year down even more because we're headed for a hard landing that they can't really prevent. Again, they might be able to make the recession a little better than it otherwise would have been. They want you to think that they control the economy. They want you to think that lower interest rates means that they're providing liquidity, or lower interest rates mean that they're quote unquote stimulating the economy. And therefore, if they just lower these interest rates, then all of a sudden we're going to see the unemployment rate flatten out and then go back down to 3.7 or 3.4. And they do that while at the same time, the inflation rate as measured by the CPI goes down to, let's say, 2.2, 2.1, 2%, something like that. And then we're off to the races. And it's why? Because the Fed just dialed it in perfectly. It's like this thermostat on the wall, and it's 69 degrees, a little too cold, 71 degrees, a little too hot. So we're just going to dial it right into 70 degrees. And then the economy is going to respond. People are going to take out more debt because now interest rates are lower. This is going to increase aggregate demand. And because aggregate demand goes up, that's what prevents us from going into the recession. And that's how they orchestrate the no landing, soft landing. This is the narrative, and this is what they want you to believe, but it never, ever, ever, ever works out that way. You just look at the SOM rule, it's a simple proxy. And all that is just a 3-month moving average of the unemployment rate relative to, I believe it's also a 3-month moving average of the low in the unemployment rate over the past 12 months. And take that back to the 1950s. It's pretty much 100% accurate. And so Claudia Sahm comes out now. I don't know why she's doing this, maybe because she's a Democrat or something like that. And she's saying that, just ignore the SOM rule, even though it's been right every single time because of immigration. So they've got X amount of people that are unemployed. And therefore, if you increase the denominator, then, that doesn't mean that, the demand side is weak. That just means the supply side is the reason why the unemployment rate is going up. Well, this is a completely bogus answer because, number one, they calculate the unemployment rate using census data from 2022, before you had this huge spike in immigration. So although it may impact the rate of inflation, it wouldn't impact the rate of change. You see, and the rate of change is what the SOM rule is obviously all about. And then also, if you want to argue that, you'd have to say that the 1970s should have also debunked the SOM rule because we had the labor force participation increasing because of women coming into the workforce. So why on earth was it just as accurate in the 1970s as it was in the 1980s and the 1990s and the 2000s? So that's the one main thing that's staring you in the face, but also interest rates. Look, if the U.S. economy was running on all 8 cylinders, you wouldn't see the 10-year Treasury trading at, I don't know where it is now, but call it 125 basis points plus under the Fed funds rate. That's not a sign of a healthy economy. It's crazy that you actually have to point that out. You say, hey, this is kind of unusual. This is very unnatural. What that is, it's the bond market telling you that future growth and inflation expectations are lower than where they are right now. Why is that? Because the bank just taking that balance sheet capacity and a lot of the financial institutions, and instead of lending that money out to the real economy, they see that as too risky. So instead they just buy treasuries, and they buy treasuries because that's quote unquote risk free. And that's where you've got the most liquidity. So whenever the market is risk off, they're going to go into the safest, most liquid asset. And globally, whether we like it or not, that is the US Treasury, and more specifically, the long end of the curve. And so that's why you see the yield curve invert, because it's the players in the global economy that have information asymmetry. These players in the treasury market that really move it one way or the other, they have a lot more information than you and I will ever have. In fact, I would argue they have way more information than the Fed will ever have, because they're the ones that are talking to these global banks in the Eurodollar system. They're the ones that are talking to these multinational corporations that are doing business, that are doing the borrowing. And so they get this intel first and foremost. And that's what prompts them to do X, Y, and Z with their balance sheet, or A, B, and C. Whether it's, okay, I'm hearing from all these multinational corporations that business is great, business is booming, and therefore, I'm going to keep lending because I'm going to try to go for that higher reward. I'm going to go for that higher yield because the risk reward makes sense. But if you're hearing the complete opposite, then you're like, no way am I going to lend out to this environment because I'm worried about being paid back. And even though I might be able to get a little higher interest rate, the risk reward doesn't make sense when I could just sit here in 10-year treasuries and collect 3.5%. And they're doing this while the Fed increases interest rates at the front end of the curve. And that's what inverts it. And that's why, in my view, the yield curve is such a powerful predictor, and that's why it has almost a 100% accuracy rate. It's because it's functioning, the underlying fundamentals or underlying actions by the market participants that drive the yield curve is, in my view, based on insider information. And insider information is a great way to trade. Just ask Nancy Pelosi. They're both idiots. I try to pay as little attention to Trump and Harris. They're both just economic knuckle draggers. I mean, they have absolutely no idea. You got one person that's just pure evil, and obviously that's Kamala Harris. And then you've got another guy that's just a complete megalomaniac that has no principles. You know, he has no kind of moral North Star that guides his decision-making process. It's just completely all over the place. Right? Now, if I had to choose between the two, obviously I'd go with Trump, because the number one concern for me, or I think Americans in general, or maybe the entire developed West, is freedom of speech. So if you're going to be a one topic voter, that topic should definitely be censorship. And you've got to go with the party that is going to censor free speech the least. And that's obviously Trump. So, you know, I don't like him, but he's a hell of a lot better than Harris. But the bottom line is I can't stand listening to either of them. When you look at these economic indicators, you can't use them to sit there and time specifically when you're going to go into a recession. What we have to do is say, how have these cycles played out in the past? So if you look, you see, okay, the first thing that happens is the curve inverts. The next thing that happens is the curve starts to steepen out due to a bull steepener, which is the front end going down faster than the long end. The next thing that happens is the unemployment rate spikes. The next thing that happens is you have an uninversion that is sustained, right? The next thing that happens is the Fed drops rates, which steepens out the curve. And then the stuff hits the fan. And then a year later, you have the NBER come out and say, oh yeah, by the way, this whole past 12 months when we were telling you that the economy was strong and resilient, yeah, go ahead and disregard that. We lied. It was actually in a recession. You know, that's exactly what they did in 2008, where they announced in December of 2008 that we had been in a recession since January. You know, it's like, oh, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. And this is the way these things play out. So what we have to do is just go through our checklist, and then we can determine the probabilities of it playing out the same way. So check number one is inversion of the curve. We got that. Okay, next we got the bull steepener. Boom, check that one off the list. The next one is the unemployment rate spiking. We got that one off the list. The next one is the uninversion of the curve that's sustained. We got that one off the list because now the 2-year is trading under the 10-year. The next thing is we got the Fed dropping rates. Boom, check that off the list. So the only other thing there is the recession and the NBER. Now, it is true, we may have a soft landing or something like that. But the bottom line is, so far, this cycle has played out the exact same way that every single cycle has played out, going all the way back to the 1950s, when you have an inversion of the curve and you have all these other, you know, the Somme rule and the spike. This is the way it always plays out. It's not 100% probability, but the probability is extremely high. And that's really how you want to position your portfolio. Me personally, I've got bets on the long end of the curve. Now, I would prefer to bet on the 2-year. I wish I could do that, but there's really not a great vehicle that gives you some good bang for your buck on betting on the 2-year. You know, you just buy the 2-year, but you're not going to get too many price moves, even if they drop rates, or even if the interest rate on the 2-year goes down substantially. So, you know, calls on the TLT is something that's interesting if you can get some liquidity. Gold is interesting if we don't have a liquidity event. Obviously, I love the chart on gold. I mean, you can't. The chart on gold is just absolutely fantastic. So the only issue with gold I have is if you go back and look at recessions where we have a liquidity crunch, the first thing people usually sell is gold because it's doing its job. Gold is insurance, and gold doesn't have counterparty risk, and you're always going to get a bid. So when we go into like a GFC type Lehman event, you're going to see gold sell off because that's the only thing that people can actually sell. And again, it's because gold is doing its job. But if you look at a recession where we don't have a liquidity event, then there's no reason for gold to sell off. And usually that's what the central planners do to try to get through the recession, is a huge, huge, huge tailwind typically for the price. So for me, I'm very comfortable just holding 10% of my portfolio in gold just as an insurance policy. But that's all I do. And then just, you know, sit back and look at the chart and see how these things play out. But I would be very hesitant with the stock market right now for obvious reasons, because it's completely overvalued. And if you're going into a recession, you really don't want to bet on the stock market. A lot of people think that if the Fed drops rates, then that means the S&P 500 will go up. But if you look at the past Fed rate cuts, you see that that's only applicable if you don't go into a recession. So if you've got all of these things lined up, then the odds are that once the Fed drops rates, that's actually negative for the S&P 500 over the next 6 months. But on that note, it depends. If we get a liquidity event, I don't put it past them to buy stocks. I mean, the Bank of Japan did it, so why on earth wouldn't the Fed? And they understand just as much as we do that the entire economy is just built or propped up by asset prices. I mean, right now we're in a depression. We are in an economic depression when you look at the poor and the middle class. There is no difference between the lot of the poor and middle class right now in the United States in 2024 than in the 1930s. The only reason why we're not at negative GDP is just because you've got the top 20% of people who own assets, and they're getting rich, and they're the ones that are out there buying the Ferraris and popping bottles of champagne and going to all the restaurants and doing all the shopping on Amazon. The poor and middle class are struggling, to say the least. And that's a wild understatement. So you have this massive bifurcation in the economy, and the Fed knows that. So my point is, if the Fed's going to try to respond to a recession, they're going to do it by trying to prop up asset prices, because that's the only thing they have.